Hi and hello. Welcome everyone. I'm Oren Pizmony-Levy, Associate Professor and Director of the Program in International and Comparative Education. I'm also the Director of the Center for Sustainable Futures. As part of my work on social movements and education, I have explored the experience of LGBTQ people across different contexts, including educational institutions, the military, and agencies that serve asylum seekers and refugees. It is my honor to serve as the moderator of this panel, which we are recording during the first week of LGBT Month 2020. I'm joined today with a panel of experts and educators, and we will be discussing the critically acclaimed documentary, Welcome to Chechnya, which uses groundbreaking filmmaking techniques to document stories of LGBTQ community members trying to escape government-sanctioned persecution in the Chechen Republic, which is a federal subject of the Russian Federation. We will be answering some of the questions you, the audience, submitted in advance, and also we will welcome your participation in the conversation, which you can do by using the chat feature on your screen. I'll begin by quickly introducing each of our esteemed panelists, but I encourage you to read more about them in their bios below. When I say your name, please wave at the audience. We are extremely honored to have the filmmaker with us today. First of all, David France, who is an award-winning American investigative reporter, nonfiction author, and Oscar-nominated documentary filmmaker. Hi, David, and welcome to our panel.
So glad to be here.
Next, I would like to introduce Kevin Jennings, a distinguished alum of Teachers College and the executive producer of the film. Kevin is the CEO of Lambda Legal. Among his other contributions to the LGBT movement, he founded the Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network, known as GLESEN, served as an Assistant Secretary of Education under President Obama, and led the Arcus Foundation, the world's largest foundation for LGBT rights organization.
Thank you, Oren.
Next, we have Dylan Kapit, 2020 TC grad in Development Disabilities, and Professor Riddhi Sandil, co-founder of the Teachers College Sexuality, Women, and Gender Project. And last but not least, my student, Yves Augustin, a current TC student studying international and comparative education. Welcome, everybody. I'm really thankful for this opportunity to chat with you about this wonderful art. I think we'll start with David and Kevin. We'll start with David and then Kevin will join. First of all, thank you so much for making this important movie. Could you share with us the background story behind the movie? What inspired each of you to make it?
The atrocities in the Chechen Republic were first reported very widely in April of 2017. And the news didn't seem to spark much political pressure on the government in Russia to do something about what was going on there. And in fact, it fell from headlines pretty quickly. It wasn't until that summer that I learned through an article in the New Yorker by the journalist Masha Gessen that the atrocities were still going on, but that in the absence of any sort of effective political pressure, it was left to ordinary LGBTQ activists in Russia to take matters into their own hands, to actually construct this vast underground global network of safe houses and relationships and ties with other LGBTQ organizations worldwide to try and find ways to rescue people's lives and get them to safety. And when I realized how dire the situation was on the ground and how much they needed the attention of the world, I reached out right away and thought this is a project where I can actually help and do some good.
Thank you. Kevin?
Well, first of all, for those people who aren't familiar with the lingo of documentary filmmaking, the director does all the real work. And the executive producer is just the guy who helps find some money to get the film made, which was my role. David approached me in the summer of 2018 and asked if I could assist in securing support to get the film made. and showed me some of the footage he had secured from his undercover trip to Chechnya. And I was so stunned and horrified by the footage he showed me that I felt immediately I needed to help bring this story to light. There's a saying by Elie Wiesel, the Nobel laureate and Holocaust survivor: there may be times when you are powerless to prevent injustice, but there must never be a time when you fail to protest it. And I felt like this was one of those times that we needed to protest what was happening in Chechnya, that we simply could not be silent. As Elie Wiesel also said, silence helps the tormentor, never the tormented.
Thank you both. David, a question about some of the artistic decisions in the movie. The stakes, of course, were very high in terms of the safety of the subject. And in the first minute of the film, the audience is reading a caption that reads, "For their safety, people who are fleeing for their lives have been digitally disguised." And the question I have for you is, how was this done in terms of the technology a little bit? And second, why was it so important to use it in the beginning and then to reveal their identity at the end? I felt like you're trying to say something to the audience with this artistic move.
Well, it's a really good question. You know, the first thing that I learned is that this is not just a campaign run by the government of the Republic to send LGBTQ Chechens into exile. It's literally a liquidation campaign, that people are being hunted wherever they go. Their family members are put under intense pressure, if they're known to be alive someplace, to bring them back for this, you know, diabolical idea that the blood of the Chechen people needs to be cleansed of LGBTQ relatives, and that meant that those poor folks that I met on my first trip there and began to film are never going to be safe. They are always going to be the target of this plan, this atrocity, and so I made them a promise that I would, if they would allow me to film them and experience this journey with them in the most intimate way, that I would find a way to disguise them. And I began working on that method when I brought the footage back, and you know, I'm not the first documentarian to want to protect people's anonymities. So I returned to the toolbox that documentary filmmakers have used over all these years, and I just found that none of the standard approaches was doing what I wanted to do, which was to expose the human cost of something as hideous as what's happening there, and to see the humanity of the people who are trying to reclaim their own narratives, trying to rebuild their lives after having been turned on by their people, by their government, by their family, and ultimately we looked at brand new technology using artificial intelligence and machine learning as a way to not blur people's faces or pixelate people's faces or put bars on people's faces or throw them into shadow, but to allow us to look at their face, to see their emotional truths, to see all of their expressions and micro-expressions, but to see it through someone else's skin. And that's what we settled on as something that we wanted to experiment with. Before using it, we wanted to make sure that it was not something that was going to throw the viewer into the uncanny valley, that it wasn't going to be disturbing and something that we pay attention to. So we actually reached out to the neuropsych lab at Dartmouth and asked them if they would advise us. And they brought our various approaches that we were working with into a trial there, a study. They enrolled 120 people to measure the various approaches and their ability to sustain an emotional connection with the subjects. And so that's what we did. Then we went and kind of worked with a team in secret to develop this approach. It had never been used before. We recruited 23 other people to lend us their faces. And they were mostly activists in the area of refugee issues, most of them LGBTQ themselves. A lot of them had already been involved in bringing political attention to the problems in Russia and the problems in Chechnya. And we asked them to do this as an act of activism, to shield the faces of the people in the film by letting us take a digital record of their faces, and then through this AI method to map kind of pixel by pixel their face over the face of the people who are being hidden. And it took forever. It took us almost a year after we finished editing the film, and in that period we spent a lot of time with the approach and a lot of time with the footage, and we thought we needed to tell the audience what was happening. We did not want to be pulling, we didn't want to be deceptive in any way. We wanted you to know who was covered and why. We made sure that this was an imperfect cover, this face double technique, so that you could see a little halo around the faces of the people who are hiding, to give you a sense in the audience that you didn't have to feel that they were being made less safe because of their involvement in the film, and also that you knew that they had to hide, and in a way we could show you that instead of telling you that. We could show you that these were people who were so deep imperiled that they needed this technique to happen. There is a person, as you mentioned, who does wrestle with and ultimately decides to go forward and bring the first and only case against the perpetrators and the Chechen government leadership. And we covered him at the first part of the film because he was existing under those same conditions and the same amount of fear, being hunted like everybody else. And we didn't want to telegraph to you that he was going to make this decision, but also in a way to remove that protective shield from him helps us understand the courage that it took for him to come forward and make himself as vulnerable as he suddenly is at that moment.
Thank you, David. I want to ask the panelists if we can use the metaphor of this technology that we just talked and take it back a little bit to talk about how can we use technology like this or other type of technologies to further implement this way of storytelling of the struggles that LGBTQ people around the world are experiencing. It could be technology like hardcore technology, or it could be other types of tools that we have in our fields. Kevin, would you like to start?
Sure. First of all, I think what David did with Welcome to Chechnya is not just an incredible film, but really groundbreaking filmmaking technique. Because what it allows you to do is to continue to relate to the subjects as human beings while also protecting their identities. And I think that, particularly in the United States, we are such an insular, navel-gazing country. Where we don't have a lot of empathy with people in other parts of the world. And that creates two problems in terms of bringing international LGBTQ stories to our country people. One is they don't necessarily understand that it is incredibly dangerous still to be LGBTQ in large parts of the world. In 70 countries, it is still illegal to be gay or lesbian. In 96 countries, it is illegal to be trans. And just simply being visible can get you killed. Not that that doesn't still happen in America, it still does, but it is the law in much of the world still. And secondly, because that experience is so foreign to many Americans, they simply can't relate to it. And we need to find a way to put a human face on it, but in a way that doesn't endanger the subjects themselves. And what David came upon here was a way that allowed you to continue to connect with the subjects of the film as human beings, yet while also protecting their identities so that they were not put at risk. And I think that that's quite brilliant, and it's a technique that we could probably use in other countries where it is similarly dangerous to be LGBTQ. I'm very hopeful that this film will not be the last such film, but will be the first of many films that will help people understand the experience of LGBTQ lives in countries where literally being queer can cost you your life.
Riddhi, do you want to speak a little bit more about how we can share the stories based on your own work and others, how we can share stories of LGBTQ people around the globe using this or other technologies?
Well, thank you for that, Oren, and thank you for David and Kevin, and to bring this really important work, because I was also really struck, because one way that we remove ourselves from the struggle of others is when we other them, and when we are not able to connect to them in a human or an emotional capacity. And I think this movie allowed us to do that, because when those people are pixelated in other documentaries, there is an experience of separation. And I think in this movie, at least for me, I got really immersed in that story of struggle. And I got to know the characters, and I felt really connected to them. And I think that is one piece where, as educators, as psychologists, as mental health workers, is oftentimes when we think about how can you increase your effectiveness or your efficacy when working with marginalized populations, it's that piece of connection. You know, as Ferrier said, that if you come to teach me, then your work here is not, I mean, I'm very badly paraphrasing, but if my struggle is your struggle, then we can work together. And I think one way that we can connect to other people's struggle is to raise our awareness of their struggle. And I think after seeing this movie, and as someone who grew up in a country where till 2016 being queer was a criminal activity, I grew up in India, and in 2016 is when we decriminalized homosexuality, as they call it. For me, I wasn't that aware of the experience in a country quite close to mine, right? So I think raising my own awareness allows me to connect, and it further empowers me to recommit myself in my work. And I think that's one way that we can certainly do it, is that piece of connection.
Thank you, Riddhi. Dylan?
So I think that it's important to note that, you know, I think most people who are not cis white gay men in the US already are experiencing this othering, right? Like, you know, my Black trans sisters are dying every day, and you know, I have lost jobs and friends because of my transness. And I think that it is important for a film like this to bring perspective to populations who don't know, but I also think it's important to know that really this type of violence is happening here too, and that this is happening across the world. But you know, to Kevin's point, there are laws here in many states that are allowing for discrimination in employment, in housing, in healthcare. And you know, the reality of a film like this is that it does both bring visibility abroad, but it also helps, you know, kind of, I think, lets people know that, like, you know, there are communities that are really hurting, and it brings visibility in a good way to other communities. And I think I just want to say that it is not an other. It is not this other thing that's happening in another country in the rest of the world, and Americans can forget about when they're not watching films. It is happening here. It is happening every day. It is a very real struggle for those of us who are not privileged, whether it's within the LGBTQ community or outside of it. And violence is a very real concern for a lot of people in the US too. And I think that's important to note.
Yves, any comments about this idea of technology and storytelling?
Well, thank you, Oren, for inviting me to this panel. Thank you, David, for your riveting and groundbreaking film. And Kevin, thank you for supporting to make this movie happen. For me, this technology, I mean, was great the way it was used. I look, first of all, I look at the movie through multiple lenses because I'm a Black gay man and an immigrant. So, and I live in a society where all those three identities are constantly under attack. But also, I also know that, I have power, my truth is my power, because look at living life the way I do. I know that I have a lot of limitations, or especially imposed by society, but I also know that I have power, which is my truth. So that's how I look at the movies. So this amazing technology for me, even though I see the greatest its greatest sort of like purpose at least the way it was used in the movie is to protect the identities of the subject, of the participants. For me, I found it more beautiful and more powerful when it was used to enhance Maxim's truth, because when Maxim had the courage enough to come out and to stand in his truth, and when you look at the movie like that, when you look at the face being dissolved, that technology being used to dissolve the face and then to kind of reveal the new face, it was not only poetic, it was brilliant, it was powerful, it was transformative. So that's what I love about the movie. So for me, any type of technology like that, I would like to see that to be used mostly and primarily to enhance the truth that we have, that we hold, that we harbor. Because again, yes, we may be marginalized, by society because we are minorities, because, we're not mainstream for whatever reason. But by the same token, we have power, and our power is our truth. So the thing I would encourage everybody, try to find your truth. Embrace your truth, stand on your truth, because your truth is your power.
Wow. Your sentence about my truth is my power could be a wonderful title for a paper, a book, or a tweet to start with. But another source of power is the power of networks of activists that work together to change a reality. And I think that was one of the themes in the movie, seeing how the network of activists are working together to really challenge the government, get the subject into a safe space. And I want to ask Kevin, as an important activist in the LGBT movement in the US, on how are activist organizations critical to the work of advancing LGBT rights in the world these days?
Well, the great Black civil rights leader of the 19th century, Frederick Douglass, once said, "Power concedes nothing without a demand." So I think the role of activists in creating social change is absolutely critical. It is not as if people with power wake up someday and go, "Gosh, we've been oppressing others. Maybe we should stop." They change because people demand that they change. And it is activists who do that. And one of the things I think is really interesting, it's very interesting in this moment of Black Lives Matter. And there's been a lot of negative reaction from a lot of white people to Black Lives Matter. The same white people who celebrate Martin Luther King Day every year. Well, if you go back and look at polling in the 1960s, something like 2/3 of white people did not approve of Martin Luther King's tactics. So activists generally are not well liked in their time, because they are questioning the current relations of power, and they are questioning the way things are. And it takes incredible courage to do that. And I think that it is what is the engine that fuels change in the world. To be very specific, today I'm the CEO of Lambda Legal. Well, until Lambda Legal won Lawrence versus Texas in 2003, same-sex relationships were still a crime in 16 American states. So before we get all holier than thou around the rest of the world, it wasn't that long ago in America that same-sex relationships were still could get you put in jail in 1/3 of this country. So the reality is things change because people demand that they change, as Frederick Douglass said over 150 years ago. And that is the only way things ever change. I have to say that the courage of the activists in this film is truly mind-blowing to me. There are so many moving moments in the film. To me, the most, I will get choked up. I've seen this film probably 50 to 100 times because I literally flew around the world to protect the safety of the people in the film. I would carry a hard drive with me that was not connected to the internet, and I would use an air-gapped computer so there'd be no chance it could be hacked into. And I would show potential funders the film on a computer that could in no way be accessed by the internet, so there'd be no chance that we were putting the subjects at risk at any point. So I have seen this film many, many, many times. I still get choked up at the end when David says, every day you make it and they don't kill you, you win. The courage it takes to be an activist and to continue to do your work, knowing that your definition of success is simply to stay alive one more day. I'm in awe of David and the other activists in the film.
Thank you, Kevin. David, similar question to you about your perspective on the role of networks of activists in this case.
Well, Kevin knows so much more about activism than I do. He's one of my heroes. I have been a journalist and a reporter, historian over these years. This is my third film about radical queer activism. I have been fascinated by the ways that queer activism redefined culture, redefined and changed history. The first film about ACT UP and AIDS activism, called How to Survive a Plague, was really about a group of people, not unlike this group of people, who were drafted by a sudden turn of events into taking on something that was insurmountable, or seemed insurmountable, an impossible task, and doing something about it. And The Death and Life of Marsha P. Johnson, about the inception of the idea of modern queer political activism, and then the founding notion about transgender activism and gender itself, coming from, again, two people, Marsha and Sylvia Rivera, who were not brought up to be these kind of seminal canonical figures, and yet they managed it. And that's really what drew me to this story in Chechnya. Was, yes, there were horrors. We knew that there would be horrors. We knew that it would be a hard story to watch, to ingest. But I was so taken by the individuals there who were busy doing other things when this happened, who had no reason to believe that they were going to be taking on authority in this way, or taking on such risks in this way. And I wanted to see if I can find in them the core of their own humanity that gave them the power to go forward and do this. Not just the power, but the mandate. They did it because they felt they had to, and they did it out of this incredible sense of love for their community, love for strangers, and love for the idea of love itself, I guess. That was what so surprised me when I met them, and what moved me into trying to elevate their stories in this way, and to really bring the story of this radical, this kernel of thing that's radical queer activism, and bring it to to the larger audience, for us all to understand what that might be, and where we could find a little bit of that in ourselves.
So that's a wonderful segue to my next question that I'm going to ask my colleagues from Teachers College. We have students and graduates who work in education, health, psychology. One can say that these are the basic fields to promote human development. And I have a question to Riddhi first. From your perspective as a faculty, how do you think TC students and graduates can promote better life for LGBTQ people in the US and abroad through activism in their own professional lives?
You know, Oren, and we've talked about this independently also, is that I'm a big believer of awareness. And I think sometimes where well-meaning activists and well-meaning helping professionals, largely spoken, broad field, I think they run into problems is when they haven't worked out their inner sense, their inner identity, or even understood their inner relationship with issues of minority oppression. So for example, if you want to be an LGBTQ activist, my question to anyone would be, what is your own understanding and relationship with LGBTQ struggle, right? And I think something to what Dylan was speaking about earlier is that there are a lot of sort of concerns in this country. There are a lot of violence that's enacted every day. And things we hear of and things we don't hear of. But I'm most curious when working with students and working with myself is what are my own biases and assumptions that I have about queerness as a queer woman, how have I made sense of my own identity in that sense. And I think unless you can unpack your own assumptions and values and prejudices, I think it's very difficult to do that work outward, right? So it's first inner work and then outer work. And I think sometimes we forget that first step, that awareness step, self-awareness and the awareness of the other. That's where I always tell, or that's where I start in this work. And I think that sort of extends to any experience of people living on the margins, whether it be queerness, people with disabilities, racial minorities, what is our own assumptions about those populations? But I'd be really curious to see what Dylan and Yves think about that as having gone through TC.
Dylan?
So I think awareness is like where we were in like 1950. Like now we're aware, okay? We know queer people exist, we're aware. I take a lot from the Black Lives Matter movement where Black folks are saying, okay, we've been here this whole time. It's not Black Lives Matter, right? It's Black lives need to be celebrated and their futures valued. And so I think a lot of that for me is like, okay, we're aware that there are queer people in the world. We've known that they've been here since the beginning of time, but it's about acceptance, and it's more than that. It's about celebration. It's about taking the real beauty of this community and celebrating it, right? Like we need to celebrate all these. There's like it's LGBTQ History Month, and let's dive into that. Let's talk about our actual history. I never learned my history in school. I went out and found it myself, and so I think it really like we need to stop with this whole awareness nonsense and celebrate each other. I think that is really the goal that I have as a special educator. We need to celebrate difference. As a trans person, we need to celebrate difference. As a queer person, we need to celebrate difference. I think that we need to leave awareness behind and move towards a society where we are really celebrating difference.
Yves?
Yes, I think TC students, can do a lot, but I think it's going to start first with their own self, their own awareness of what it's like to be an activist. I'm going to talk about my own journey. So for me, activism is like a calling, but it's not a calling that you become aware of it right away. It's a calling that reveals itself to you sometimes after many years. I mean, I guess for some people, sometimes it may reveal itself, a little bit earlier. But again, it's a process. It's not like something you just decide one day, you become an activist. So I remember watching a video about John Lewis after he passed away, civil rights icon John Lewis. And in this video, he started talking about like when he was like a teenager or something like that. He was doing segregation. And his parents were telling him that, he had to behave. He had to obey the laws, especially the segregation laws, respect, when it says for white only, for colored only, whatever. So he was struck. I mean, he was struggle with this. And yeah, he was struck by this, but also he was struggling with this. Because he said, how can people accept that? This is not okay to me. So then to me, I think that was the beginning of his calling. He started questioning this. And then when he heard about Dr. King, I think he was like probably 17, and then there was going to be this march. So he wrote Dr. King a letter saying, you know what, I want to join you. And, the guy is only 17, so Dr. King said, sure, you can come in. But to me, that's the beginning of that questioning. So I was born in Haiti, poor. My father was not in the picture. My mother was a peasant woman. And I kind of sensed that I was different, from the other kid. I was a bit effeminate. And people would say, oh, you're going to becoming gay, and also because I was poor. So I was not sort of looked at or viewed favorably. And actually, my mother was like the most courageous person I know and I learned. And as a woman, she was both my mother and my father. My father was not in the picture to teach me anything. My mother taught me everything, and especially courage. And I also know the reason why I'm mentioning courage, because courage is often associated as a male trait. But my mother taught me courage beyond the limited scope of Haitian society, the way Haitian society view courage. So I just want to make sure. So that's my shout out to my mom who's in heaven. I would be remiss if I do not give a shout out to Charlot Jeudi. Charlot Jeudi was the most prominent gay activist in Haiti. I did not know him personally, so I became aware of it a few years ago. And I knew he was doing a lot of good work. So he was able to say what most gay Haitians, lesbian, whatever, I've not been able to say. For example, when I was growing up, I knew there were a lot of gay folks. It's like we had our underground, community and everything like that. So I think Charlot Jeudi was the first one to have gone on, on national TV, on speaking on radio, to say this is not okay for you to treat us like that. We have rights. We demand equality, we demand respect. So I wanted to give a shout out to him because, again, like I said, he was the first one. And so far, I don't know if there's anybody else that's gonna, take his place. I mean, I wish, if I go back, I would definitely do that. But what he did is so courageous. And still today, you have a lot of people who even have, let's say, more education than he had, more opportunities, but then they don't have the courage that he had. So for me, he's a hero. So I just want to give him a shout out to him. And to me, that's a true activist. So it was, like I said, he received the call and he answered the call. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
If I may jump in, because I really, part of I've been at TC for 9 years, and part of what I love about TC is dialogue. And I mean, I really appreciate what Dylan and Yves said, but I really wanted to respond to Dylan. And I think you bring up a really important point, which also speaks to generational differences, right, that might exist. Because when you say awareness is 1950, I'm actually really, I'm very empowered by that statement. And I think what I might respectfully disagree with you, actually, is that I agree that we need to celebrate diversity, queerness being one aspect of it, and we need to affirm gay people and queer people and trans people. But I think in my experience, it's very hard sometimes to get that affirmation if people are not aware of my struggle or are not aware of my existence. And I think that's what I was speaking to a little bit, that I consider myself very privileged to live in New York City and to interface with people like you who are just so wise beyond their years and are just activists, and they help me live a better life. But I also interact with a lot of people in my life who don't understand the difference between trans and gay, right? I mean, they're very rudimentary in their understanding of queerness and their understanding of gender and or sexuality. So while I totally agree, I want to live in a world where I can be like, guys, come on, or people, get with this. We are done trying to educate and we need to move to celebration. However, at least in my world, I find that it's not, we're not there yet. And I use myself in that group. But I hope one day, Dylan, that it's going to be.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah,
aloud?
Yes, of course, I would love to hear that. Yeah.
So my grandma's 85 and she's a Holocaust survivor, and she's a wonderful woman. And when I came out to her, when I was 12 and I was like, I'm queer, she was like, I don't know what that means. And I was like, okay, let's talk about it. And it is just such proof to me. She now has a shirt that says like, I heart my trans grandchild. And it is just such proof to me that like, there is no limit on the difference. But, awareness is like, we're going to have this conversation for 2 days. And then I think it is a generational thing, because I'm 26. I just turned 26. My generation is like, awareness is not enough. And we, in fact, are demanding more. And I think it is a thing where I think, my parents were like, awareness is nice. And I think it is, it's my generation. I teach elementary special ed. And so I think it's what I'm trying to teach them is that, okay, you learn about this, right? That's awareness. Like, there's people who are different. And then step 2 is let's celebrate that difference. And so I think you're right that awareness is important. I just think it is also not enough. And that I think we should like, awareness is a great start, and then we push for celebration. And it is just, I tell everyone all the time, I'm like, if my 85-year-old grandmother who escaped from the Nazis when she was 11 can like come around and understand that I'm queer and trans and autistic, anyone can do it. Because I think that you have a conversation and awareness is great, and then day 2 you're like, and now let's celebrate, let's move. I'm not saying we should not have awareness, because obviously we need to have awareness, but I think that it really is like a young activist thing where it's like, awareness is nice, but I need more. And I'm inspired by, like, literally, I'm inspired by the teenagers who are marching for climate justice, who are going to change the world, because those are the ones, it's not even my generation, it's them who are like, oh, we don't even care about awareness, we want celebration. And so it's I'm looking to them to lead. I think that it is a generational thing, it's an age thing, but I will push for celebration till the day I die, because I think everyone deserves it.
I'm going to be right behind you, Dylan, pushing for that celebration as well. So thank you.
Thank you both for the dialogue. As Riddhi said, this is one of the nicest part of TC, that we can actually have this dialogue and learn from disagreements. I wanted just to make a comment, as Dylan was talking about the youth climate marches that we are seeing these days, is that even in research around environmentalism, we see a move away from only awareness as a first step to behavior change. And we have more and more research now showing that, first of all, we can actually have behavior change, and then the awareness will come. So I think this linear perspective is really changing, not only in how Dylan was talking about that, but also in the way we approach it in research around climate and human rights issues as well. I know we have a lot of questions coming in from the audience, but I want to ask one last question, and I'm going to focus on Kevin and David. As educators, as people responsible for this wonderful art, from your perspective, what should we be doing to prevent human rights violations like the one features in this movie, abroad and in our own community?
I think we should start with Kevin, because I don't know what educators, I don't know the tools that educators might be able to use to counter something like this. I don't know how, I know how media should do it. I know how politics should do it and politicians should do it. But educators have a unique tool set that I'm not familiar with.
First of all, I think that David should talk about his expertise. But as somebody who was a teacher and is a TC graduate, I actually think that Yves gave us the way earlier in his remarks. Your truth is your power, as Yves so eloquently put it. And our job as educators is to create environments where people can discover and then speak their truths. What we're really teaching people in the end is that. It isn't math or science or history or English or some language. If we're really gifted teachers, what we do is we help people find their truths, and we create a space where they are comfortable speaking them. And that will create change. And secondly, this is a very tired metaphor, which everyone on the TC faculty and in the alumni body and in the student body knows. But of course, part of the job of a good curriculum is to give students both windows and mirrors. Mirrors in which they can see themselves and windows in which they can see into the lives of others. And I think that it's very, very important that, particularly in the United States, which, as I mentioned before, is a very insular, very inward-looking society, that we bring in the experiences of people from around the world so that young people understand that the American way is not the only way, or, God forbid, not always the best way. Something that Americans have a very hard time grasping. And that there are a multiplicity of experiences in the world. And whatever we can do as educators to help young people understand that, I think is very, very important. Because I think that empathy is an incredibly important skill to cultivate among young people. And I think the brilliance of this film is that the empathy it inculcates in the viewer. Well, I've seen the film both one-on-one with folks and also in audience settings back when we had live audiences before COVID hit. And there would be moments in the film when people would literally gasp. Because they were so engrossed in the human side of this story that when events would happen in the film, they would gasp. For me personally, the film that changed my life was a film called The Times of Harvey Milk, which was a documentary that won the Oscar in 1984. And that was a film that showed me a mirror as a young gay person of what my life could be. And it convinced me to become an activist. You asked me the questions about activism earlier. It convinced me to become an activist. So I think that using tools like films and literature and other tools like that as an educator, which can introduce people both to experiences like their own and to experiences unlike their own, can help develop people's sense of their own truth and also their ability to appreciate the truths of people not like themselves.
Can I respond? I know that question was not for me, but can I answer it?
Please.
So I think that is a great point, Kevin. And I think that, like, in order to give the mirrors and the windows, in order to celebrate differences, we have to teach the differences. We have to give kids the knowledge about all of the differences that there are with the language that we want them to use to describe those differences. I, did not have the word transgender until I moved to New York at 18 and met other trans people. And it was so powerful for me to hear other people using words to describe themselves that I had never learned. And so I have tried to do that in my teaching and teach kids about people who are different than they are, about their own histories that they may not know, about if it's, and not just when it's convenient, like not just LGBTQ History Month, but we're reading books with queer characters in March because that, maybe that kid who has never heard any of those words before is having these doubts and then sees themselves in a curriculum. And I think that is something that I want across the board, TC and all teaching institutions to just drill into your students' heads that you need to share those differences with kids so that they have the chance to see people like them in their curriculum, because language changes lives, empathy changes lives, visibility changes lives, and I think those things are really important.
Thank you so much, Dylan and Kevin. I'm going to move to some questions from the audience that we received. And I'm inviting the audience, of course, to continue the conversation later on Twitter by tagging the hashtag TCACFest and Teachers College. We have a lot of questions. Let's start. I'll start with a question to David. Did completing this film take a physical and mental toll on you?
It certainly did. I mean, just encountering the reality of the horrible reality of life in Russia was something that I wasn't at all prepared for. I'm a veteran journalist. I've covered wars around the world. I've seen some really horrible things, but the sense of being so alone that permeated the lives of the people I met who are engaged in this battle to feel so undefended, to feel so unheard, was a really emotionally difficult to experience it. And it wasn't just me. It was everybody who worked on the production. And when we brought it back to New York to work on the footage, to find our story, we put together a crew made up largely of asylum seekers from Russia. We needed the Russian language to be the primary language in the studio. And they were mostly LGBT Russians who had experienced their own traumas there. And so this really was triggering for them in a way that I think was much more profound than it was for me.
Just to follow up on your comment on the editing process of the movie, we have a question from the audience asking, were there any scenes that ended up on the cutting room floor that you wish you had included if you had time in the movie?
There were so many stories and so many people whose stories never made it to the final film. We cut all those stories together, and obviously there's just a physical limit to the amount of time you can ask an audience to sit to watch something. We didn't want to spread this reporting out over a series, for example, or a limited series, or we wanted to capture it in a way that was, in a single sitting, you would understand. And so there are people who I just fell madly in love with, whose stories were so unique to their own lives. There was a young woman who had fled because after she had been given an ultimatum by her father that she had a choice to make: either go to the mental hospital to be cured, and if that failed, they would kill her, or go to the imam for an exorcism, and if that failed, they would kill her. And she chose the exorcism. She tells the story about having endured a full day of emotional torture in an effort to try to convince her family that she was being cured of this lesbianism, and then trying to find a way to get out of there on her own, and then watching her blossom in the shelter system into a sense of a gay identity, a lesbian identity, into a sense of being a member of a community with unique and shared interests and characters, watching her fall in love, watching her leave the country. I filmed with her as she left the country and set up herself in her new country, in her new city, and watched her get engaged. I kept filming her. I loved her so much. And maybe one day hers will be its own film, but I found that it detracted from the message that was so important here, which is that this is going on still, and it was really important for me to keep my focus with the activists who enjoy knowing that they've succeeded in freeing people, but their work isn't done. So she, unfortunately, and I'm still apologizing to her for not yet having told her story.
Okay, the movie shed light on the violence and prejudice that LGBTQ people are experiencing in Chechnya, but I think the audience gets the bigger picture that it's happening around the world, even in the US today, as Kevin and others mentioned earlier. And I'm inviting the panelists, based on the question we just got, if you are comfortable with sharing a little bit about your experience with prejudice and violence, whether it's in the US or abroad, that is based on LGBT or SOGI status. I will let anyone jump in.
I thought about this question and I thought about answering it, and I wanted to say something else instead. If you are not LGBT, you can assume that an LGBT person has experienced prejudice and bigotry and violence. You can just assume it. Just like if you're white, you could assume that a person of color has experienced racism, or if you are male identified, you can assume that a female identified person has experienced sexism or sexual violence. So I'm perfectly happy if any of my fellow panelists want to tell their stories. But I think that for people who come from majority cultures, and I am white and male, so clearly I come from a majority culture in some respects, you just need to assume that people who come from traditionally disenfranchised groups, of course we have experienced prejudice, of course we have experienced discrimination, and most likely we have experienced violence. That comes with the territory of being different in this world. I have. I would bet cash money, as my mama would say, that all of the other panelists have. I've lost jobs. I've lost teeth. I've lost family members because of my being gay. That comes with, that's par for the territory. So I think that it was an amazing moment for me as a young man when I learned the fact that 1/4 of all women had been raped. And that I could assume that if I was in a room with 4 women, one of them had probably been sexually assaulted. And I suddenly started looking at all my female friends totally differently. Because when you're a man, I think that you, on some level, think that rape is an unusual, exceptional event instead of something that a large number of women have experienced. And so, no disrespect to whoever asked the question, but I think the question shows a certain level of naivete.
Yeah, I'd like to piggyback on what Kevin said. So I think there's a certain level of naivety in the question, but I'll definitely go beyond that. So again, anybody who belongs to any disenfranchised, group or community, would be experiencing violence, or mistreatment at some point in their lives. Sometimes it's physical, sometimes it's emotional, sometimes it's not a silence, it's actual, like, let's say, like a look, that somebody gave you. Sometimes it's not really visible. Sometimes it's even just, not just visible. There's another word. It's nonverbal. Sometimes it's nonverbal. So you experience that kind of silence. I remember when I was a kid, kids started treating me, differently. They would push me sometimes, they would give me what we call a zoklo, a knock in the head. And then, they would call me sissy boy. And my mother would always come to my rescue, and which was kind of interesting. And, but I always remember some of the, because he would not just come to my rescue, but also she would use some powerful bottles, to those people, whether it was other kids or whether sometimes also adults as well. And then she would tell them, I always remember that. She would tell them that I did not give I did not give birth to a sissy boy. I gave birth to a son. And my son can choose whatever he wants. So if my son chooses to become gay later in life, he will do it, but he will do it far away. And you will never be able to see that. He will do it in a more developed countries where people have more rights, where people are more open-minded and things like that. And I was shocked when by hearing that. So not only to me that was like an indication that she would love me. She loved me unconditionally, because if she could already admit the possibility, or even defend me, to put the possibility that I may be gay and that would be okay for her. But also to me, it's like she was planting a seed in my head saying, my son, I know you're special, but Haiti is too small for you. You have to go somewhere else.
Thank you so much. Dylan, if you want a quick comment, that would be great.
So I just want to say, yes, I agree, Kevin. And I think there are also, to your earlier point, people who think this is only happening elsewhere, and that there is power in telling the stories, there is power in letting people know that this is happening here. And I think in order to be clear about that, we have to talk about it. And I think, it makes people uncomfortable to hear that I get called a faggot regularly. That is an uncomfortable thing for people to know. But also, I think, that's my truth. And it is helpful for people to understand that it is 2020 and we are still doing this, and that these are not problems that are happening in other countries or 50 years ago. Like, we are still doing this. And I think the only way, yes, we can assume everyone has been through this violence, but if we don't talk about it, then people assume it's not going on. And it really is a huge problem. And so I think in order to tell the cis het white folks who refuse to admit that it's going on, we have to talk about it.
Thank you, everybody. I'm sure others wanted to share as well, but in sake of time, I will end up with a last question from the audience, and I'm inviting everybody to give really quick response so we can hear from everybody. And the question goes like this: as we see the rise of far-right ideology or the anti-gender movement in Europe, for example, and even in our own country, what are some of the best resources you know of to support LGBTQ friends and families? So I'm inviting everybody to really give us a quick response so we can hear from everybody. I will start with David.
Just one word, and that's activism. I think when we see people get out in the streets, we see change made, and it's time. And we've been seeing it happen. The one thing that's given me hope in this last year has been the example of Black Lives Matter and the progress that they're making, and the ways that they will continue to work to fight this right-wing movement and to bring us to a brand new place. And that's thrilling, and it gives me a lot to hope for.
Riddhi?
I would encourage everyone who has class privilege to donate their money to grassroots organizations. I think sometimes people get scared of activism and they think of activism in one way, but if you have enough in surplus, give. I'm particularly fond of the Audre Lorde Project in New York City, so please donate.
Dylan?
Piggybacking off of that, I say if you know organizations who are raising money for Black trans folks to get gender confirmation surgery or hormones, giving directly to people who can't afford those things, that is active life-saving material right there. There are many organizations who fundraise directly for those things, and those things save lives. So giving to organizations who help make those things happen.
Kevin?
So many. Let me say three quick things. First of all, give to Rainbow Railroad, which helps people in places like Chechnya get to safer places. Give to All Out, which works to improve LGBTQ human rights around the world. And third, remember the words of the great gay artist Andy Warhol. People will tell you that time changes things, but actually you have to change them yourself.
Great. Yves?
Well, I have two resources in mind, because I've used them a lot and I continue to use them. First, I would say education. Education. But not necessarily education in the classroom. Because I know, especially in the West, formal education, formal schooling, that's all they know. That's okay. But in other societies, it's differently. You know, in Haiti, we have a lot of non-formal education. We have a lot of informal education. And by that, I mean, you know, you talk to your community leaders, you talk to your neighbors, you talk to elders who know more than you. We talk to neighbors. I mean, you learn, you know, even, watching TV, watching videos, you know, pick up a book, you know, movies, and you can learn from their stories. Because again, the more information you have, the more knowledge you gain, and the more options you have, because you can start like, not just debating, but also constructing, comparing, you know, knowledge that, oh, well, you know, they did this way, you know what I mean? It makes you, it gives you more option. Then you can say, well, you know what, I can go this way, I can go that way. So that's why education, information, knowledge is really important, is really key. It doesn't matter where you find it. So the second thing I'm going to talk about, which I did not see being mentioned in the movie, which is spirituality. And spirituality is not necessarily from a religious perspective, because again, not everybody goes to church or even have a defined religion. But I'm sure everybody sort of like believes there's a higher power, whatever that higher power is. I know I am surrounded with angels, with gods and goddesses that will help me through this journey, because that's what the oppressors doesn't want you to know. that you have power, and also that you have backup. Because I have backup. My angels are my backup. My gods and goddesses, my mother who's in heaven, she's my backup. You know what I mean? So when you think of it that way, then you can face anything. Nobody can tell you, oh, you know what, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to put you in jail because you're LGBTQ, because your life matters. I said, Willie, my life may not matter to you, but my life matters to a lot of people. And then knowing that you have that backup, then that can inspire you, can strengthen you to fight back, to wage over, to stand in your truth and not be silent and not give them that power.
Okay, thank you, everybody, for joining me today on this panel. I would like really to thank you for taking the time and for all your wise comments. This has been a very powerful discussion. I think that the audience can take a lot of ideas and things to think about. And I think this panel is bringing us closer to this point of celebrating the different voices, different ideas, the diversity within the movement. I think we talked about that, and I appreciate that opportunity. And I want to thank the audience for joining us today, for celebrating Academic Festival at Teachers College and also the LGBT Pride Month in general. So thank you very much, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.